What is going on, guys? This is Jake at That Fit Friend, and today we are going to be talking about the dumbbell bench press, and more specifically, 4 common mistakes that I see lifters make all the time with this exercise. We'll also talk about how to better perform dumbbell bench presses to drive the adaptations we are after. With all that being said, I have timestamped everything down below, so check out the timestamps if you want to jump around, get the information you need, and get out of this video and go train. But let's go ahead and dive in to mistake number 1. Mistake number 1 is exceeding an active, productive range of motion with our pec major fibers. So what does this mean? What does it look like in practice? So imagine I'm on a bench and I'm dumbbell bench pressing. I have dumbbells in my hands. Exceeding an active range of motion would be this range of motion down here. Like if I was bringing this all the way down and trying to hit the dumbbell head on my chest, and I'm back here with my humerus in relation to my torso, that would be potentially exceeding my active range. Because when we are talking about the dumbbell bench press, generally we are trying to do 2 things. Number 1, increase our horizontal pressing strength, and then number 2, cause muscular hypertrophy of the pec major fibers. If we're coming down here past our active range, we could be losing out on some of the tension that we could be trying to facilitate with the pec major fibers. So generally with dumbbell bench presses, we are trying to hit the sternal pec fibers. These are the pec fibers that originate off of the sternum, wrap up the chest, and then insert into the humerus. If we're coming way down here, we could be losing out on our ability to physically maintain tension on these muscles. So we could be going into a range of motion that's not exactly productive for the overall growth of our pec or just our overall horizontal pressing strength if we're talking about pec major fibers specifically. Plus, this additional energy and effort required to come out of this bottom position here could actually limit or be a limiting factor in some of our sets, whether our goal is strength or hypertrophy. So when conceptualizing this, think about having your humerus track to about the torso or just below it. If you're exceeding well past that torso, you might be losing out on some of the tension you could be productively creating on that pec major, and you could actually be creating more energy and effort than you physically need to drive the hypertrophy and strength needle forward for your pec major fibers. Mistake number 2, and I think we've all been guilty of this one, is pressing with those elbows out versus having them tucked a little bit. Now, why is this a mistake in the context of dumbbell bench pressing? Well, circling back to point and mistake number 1, if we are trying to create muscular hypertrophy or strength adaptations through the pec major fibers that we are after, aka the sternal pec fibers, if our elbows are out, we're going to be shifting a lot of the load and emphasis into our anterior deltoids. So when it comes to hypertrophy, for example, we're likely going to have the anterior deltoids fatigue and be a limiting factor before we can physically take our sternal pec fibers to a high degree of mechanical tension. So having the elbows out could be a limiting factor for driving the needle forward when it comes to physically hitting the pec fibers we are after with the dumbbell bench press. As a general rule of thumb, think about tucking those elbows 30 to 45 degrees and also having your grip rotate slightly to accommodate this. You do not need to maintain a pronated grip if you are tucking the elbows. Have those dumbbells track a little bit differently and go with what's most comfortable for you, but also don't be afraid to play around with different elbow positions. Because we're all built a little bit differently, there isn't really a one-size-fits-all elbow position that you need for the dumbbell bench press. So when in doubt, tuck 30 to 45 degrees and play around with different press angles to see what facilitates the highest degrees of tension through your pec fibers. Mistake number 3, and I think we've all done this one as well, is pressing weight out and away. So why is this a problem? Well, for starters, it's going to be unproductive when it comes to us actually being able to maintain adequate tension on the pec major fibers we are after. But 2, it's then going to shift more load and emphasis into the anterior deltoids, which can then serve as a limiting factor which could hinder our progressions with our pec major hypertrophy and strength gains. So when in doubt, when you're pressing, look at your wrist, elbow, and shoulder position towards lockout. If these are stacked, that's a good indication that you're not wasting a ton of effort and putting a lot of emphasis into the anterior deltoids. Plus, if we're talking about more advanced hypertrophy concepts and we're using, like, let's say a soft lockout to maintain higher degrees of tension, which is something my coach Adam Miller at N1 Training uses a lot with me, if we're pressing out and away, once again, it's just not going to be productive for allowing us to take those sternal pec fibers to true mechanical failure, or at least close to mechanical failure, to drive strength and hypertrophy further. So that all being said, with this mistake, focus on your pathing with the press, and if you're pressing out and away, there's a good indication that you could be wasting effort and shifting more emphasis into the anterior deltoids than you are trying to. Mistake number 4 is clinking the dumbbells together at the top. And I know with bigger dumbbell heads, it can be a little bit difficult to not do this. However, it can be a problem because one, when we clink those together, if we're working with heavier weights, even if we're just softly tapping them, that amount of momentum with them when they hit each other can then throw us out of our pathing, and it could require more effort to stabilize at the top before we start our next rep. If we're just clinking them together with lighter weights, once again, it can throw off our pathing and just create extra effort and energy and take away from what we're trying to do, which is create adequate tension on the pec major fibers. So when in doubt and you're pressing upwards, you do not need to fully bring the dumbbells together. The pecs are going to adduct anyways, and you're going to get a lot of productive range of motion through this bottom to mid-range portion. And at the top, you do not need to necessarily bring them together to get a higher stimulus. And honestly, I think bringing them together and clinking them apart is going to cause more of an energy waste than actually create a productive one. So now let's talk about, I think, sequencing the dumbbell bench press in a more productive means to create more growth through the sternal pec fibers. Now, what I want you to do is if you're pressing like this, focus on bringing your elbows into about 30 to 45-ish degrees to start, bringing your hands into a slightly more supinated / neutral position. You don't have to go true neutral. I'll often go with like an in-between between pronation and supination. So I'll go with a more middle ground here. And then when you are bringing the dumbbells down, once again, focus on your humerus and where it's landing at the eccentric. You want that humerus to be right around where the torso is. If you have good range of motion, you can go a little bit past it, that's fine. But when you go super deep, remember, we could lose out on some of that pec major fiber tension that we are after. Now, when you are pressing up, I want you to think about not packing the scaps back. Allow the scaps to move and press upwards, thinking about bringing your elbow directly under the wrist and creating this adduction range of motion by pulling the pecs together. So pull, 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 and then lock out as so. We are not going pull, 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 clink. We're pulling together, locking out, and then starting our next rep accordingly. This sequencing is going to be much more productive for keeping adequate tension on the sternal pec fibers. And honestly, I think you're going to feel a lot better pressing with this style across the board, especially if your goals are building up your pec strength through the horizontal pressing pattern and building your pec muscle fibers. So try that out. Let me know how it goes, and don't be afraid to play with different tempos and weights to make sure you're getting the pathing and sequencing down with this pressing style. All right guys, that wraps up this video on the dumbbell bench press. Hopefully you were able to take something away and apply it to your training to make you more productive with hitting the pec major fibers. So two key things to take away with this video is number one, we are all built slightly differently, and based on the context of our goals, anatomy, and needs, that will change how we are performing the dumbbell bench press. So please don't just take this video and say like, oh, this is the only way to perform this exercise. It is a way, and a way that I like to conceptualize and coach this movement. The second thing is that if you want to learn more about pec muscular hypertrophy, check out M1 Training. They are a fantastic resource for this topic. And lastly, if you have any questions, drop them down below or reach out to me personally, whichever you prefer, and drop a like on the video, drop subscribe to the channel, and PS, yes, those are rings in my apartment. Tell me you're a gym rat without telling me you're a gym rat. Thank you.